1946 was the year of hope, with the ending of World War II just months before, and the Cold War not set to begin until the following year. But for 8 people in the twin cities of Texarkana, they would find themselves the victims of a brutal serial killer. 5 would be dead, and the other 3 seriously injured with psychological wounds that would never heal. These killings would become known as the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, and the unknown perpetrator was given the name the Phantom by the local newspapers. He targeted couples late at night, parked in their cars on lovers' lanes. The crimes would create a mass panic in the Texarkana area that lasted for months, and the case was never officially solved. But unknown to anyone outside of law enforcement, some of the investigators were pretty sure that they caught the Phantom for an unrelated crime. And while they were never able to prove his guilt in the murders, beyond circumstantial evidence, they did manage to put him in prison for decades on other charges. But did they get the right guy? Similar murders of couples in their cars would occur throughout the entire United States in the decades to come, most famously with the Zodiac killer. So were these crimes committed by the Phantom because the heat from his first murders drove him out of Texarkana, or are they the work of copycats? In this documentary, we will explore the events in Texarkana during the spring of 1946, the police investigation that involved everyone from local cops to Texas Rangers and the FBI, and the case for and against that Youell Lee Swinney was the Phantom killer. But before we begin, we would like to remind you that if you enjoy this video, please click the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment about your thoughts on the case. Texarkana is one of the most interesting twin cities in the United States. Culturally, it's one city, but because half of it is in Texas and the other half is in Arkansas, its government is split between the state lines at State Street. There are 2 mayors, 2 city councils, and 2 of everything that one city needs, including 2 school districts that are often rivals of each other. In the opening of 1946, the population of the whole Texarkana metropolitan area was about 45,000 people. It was also a minor industrial hub with a lively downtown. The city limits were rural, but slowly expanding as the population grew. Texarkana has been described as the gateway between Texas and the East. Its position made it a major railroad connection, and several highways pass through the area as well. In addition to Texas and Arkansas, the state borders of Louisiana and Oklahoma are also close to the cities, giving the greater region the name of the 4 states area. Now, its role as a major transportation hub also brought a higher than average crime rate thanks to the many people who were just passing through. But these occurrences usually took place in the same parts of town, and were not too difficult for the police to solve as the victims knew their attackers. And this was a southern town, so there was segregation and Jim Crow laws that oppressed the approximately 1/3 of African American residences. But for the middle-class white population, they were for the most part blissfully unaware of Texarkana's seedy underworld. Instead, it was a town that personified the American dream of nice homes to raise children with white picket fences. If you minded your own business and kept away from the bad areas, then you were going to do fine. But that illusion began to be shattered on the night of Friday, February 22nd, for this would be the first documented attack of the Texarkana Phantom Killer. The night had started off promising for Jimmy Hollis and his girlfriend Mary Jeanne Larey. Hollis was 25 and worked at an insurance agency with his older brother, while Mary Jeanne was 19 with her whole life in front of her. Hollis had tried to enlist to fight in World War II, but was rejected from the service because of a heart condition, which led to him taking a job in a factory assembling aircraft. In 1942, he married, but by 1946, that marriage deteriorated, with both sides mutually agreeing to divorce. Mary Jeanne Larey was born Mary Jeanne Harris. The last name of Larey came from her own broken marriage. She had married Roland Larey in 1943, just before he shipped off to the Navy. When he returned home from the war, the spark of love was gone, and they also agreed to get a divorce. Jimmy and Mary Jeanne's divorces were not finalized yet, but that didn't stop them from trying to find love while they were still young. On this particular night, they went on a double date to the movies with Jimmy's older brother Bob and a woman named Virginia, whom Bob would eventually marry. After the movie, Jimmy dropped Virginia and Bob off at their homes and was going to do the same with Mary Jeanne when they both decided that they didn't want this great evening to end yet. They drove around for a bit before Jimmy turned on to the gravel Richmond Road. Today this is the site of the Central Mall, but in 1946 this was the town's outskirts without any homes, buildings, or people nearby. It was a known lover's lane where couples could find privacy from the rest of the world. According to the couple, their time on Richmond Road was spent by talking to each other, with Jimmy trying his best to impress his date. They felt safe and isolated in this area, and Jimmy stepped out of the car to show Mary Jeanne some star constellations that he knew. Almost as soon as he was out of the car, he was blinded by a flashlight. The light was too bright for him to tell anything distinct about the person holding it, except maybe that he was 6 feet tall. But he could tell from the man's voice that he was mean and angry. Jimmy didn't know if this was a prank or a case of mistaken identity, so he told him that he had the wrong guy, to which the man warned,
"I don't want to kill you, fellow, so do what I say,"
as he revealed a gun in his other hand. Jimmy raised his hands and stepped between the man and Mary Jeanne, promising to do whatever he wanted.
"Take off your goddamn birches,"
the man ordered. Jimmy was confused, and Mary Jeanne begged him to do it, so he did. Mary Jeanne then told the man holding the flashlight and gun that they didn't have any money. But the only response her pleas generated was a pistol whipping to Jimmy Hollis's head. 2 brutal hits, with the second one producing a cracking sound that was so loud, Mary Jeanne thought her boyfriend had been shot. In reality, his skull was fractured. Mary Jeanne thought that she was about to die, when then, much to her surprise, the man turned to her and told her to run. She took off and headed towards a ditch, which prompted the man to yell out to her that she needed to go towards the road, and she did. While she was running, she noticed an old car parked to the side that didn't have any people in it, but she couldn't tell much details about it because she was focused on getting away. Unfortunately, the man chased after and overpowered her. He tackled her to the ground and demanded to know why she was running. When she told him it was because he told her to, he called her a liar and became angry. He pinned her down and moved his gun below her waist, where he used the barrel to sexually assault her. She tried to resist, but he was too strong. It was here, when she was no longer blinded by the light, that she was able to get a look at her assailant. Unfortunately, this didn't offer any clues about the man's identity because he was wearing a mask. The trauma of the next few moments were difficult for Mary Jeanne to remember, but she was sure that this man had intended to bring her back to the car and kill her. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the road coming towards them. The man got up and ran into the darkness, where he disappeared. Mary Jeanne wasted no time, and thinking that her date was dead, she fled towards the nearest houses, screaming for help. Jimmy Hollis, meanwhile, regained consciousness and wandered around in the daze. A motorist, maybe the same one that accidentally saved Mary Jeanne, stopped to see if he was okay. Jimmy begged the man to get help. The man in the car drove to the nearest payphone and called the police. At the same time, Mary Jeanne found help from one of the houses, and they also called the cops. Less than half an hour later, Bowie County, Texas Sheriff Bill Presley was on the scene with 3 officers. Jimmy and Mary Jeanne were taken to the hospital, while there was no sign at all of who the man in the mask was or where he went. The police would believe that this was either a targeted crime, because of the couple's status of both currently going through the divorce process, or it was a completely random attack. This was a serious crime, but the fact that both Jimmy and Mary Jeanne survived made it an assault. And as crime in Texarkana continued to flow, this incident did not receive too high of a priority. The concept and psychology of serial killers was not well known to anyone in 1946. It wouldn't be until the 1970s when the subject would start to receive in-depth study. But we now know with hindsight that this was the first documented attack of the Phantom, and mistakes were made on his part, which allowed his victims to escape the death he meant to deal to them. But this attack was a learning experience, and the next time that he was going to strike, he was going to succeed in his mission to commit murder. The effort to win World War II saw America's factories repurposed to create the vehicles and equipment necessary to conquer the battlefield. As a result, 1941 was the last year that new cars were produced. With the war ended in 1946, every single car on America's roads was a few years old, and the reduced supply, combined with an increased demand from service members returning home, saw used cars becoming very valuable. They were also incredibly easy to steal through hot wiring, which any novice thief could accomplish. Richard Griffin was a 29-year-old discharged Navy veteran who returned to his home state of Texas. He purchased a 1941 Oldsmobile that was beat up and spent the war years working as a taxicab. But it was all he could afford and find, so he settled on it. Shortly after his return home, he began dating a 17-year-old woman named Polly Ann Moore. Polly Ann graduated from high school when she was 16 and worked as a checker at a local arsenal factory. Her job was to manage the inventory of weapons being shipped out. Despite the 12-year age difference between the couple, none of their families objected to the relationship, which would go on for 6 weeks before its abrupt ending on March 24th, 1946. In the month between the Phantom's first and second attacks, the police did try to investigate the near murders of Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jeanne Larey, but they got nowhere. For starters, the only thing the couple could agree on was that the attacker was angry and tall. But Jimmy, who didn't get a good look at him, thought that the suspect was white with a tan, while Mary Jeanne said he was a black man with light skin. Detectives checked their soon-to-be divorced spouses as possibly being involved, but after interviews with both people, they decided that there was not a connection. At best, this was a random attack, and at worst, the couple knew who attacked them but were covering it up, either to protect this person or out of fear. Hollis was seriously injured and spent weeks in the hospital to recover. Sometimes he would become violent in his sleep, like he was fighting off his attacker in his dreams. He grew frustrated with the lack of progress in the investigation and warned Sheriff Presley that the next time this man attacked, he was going to kill someone. Mary Jeanne was too afraid to stay in Texarkana, and she moved to Oklahoma to stay with relatives there. After Jimmy recovered enough to be released, he traveled there to visit her and see if there was a chance that the relationship could continue. But for Mary Jeanne, the psychological trauma was too great and she couldn't do it. Jimmy Hollis returned to Texarkana with a broken heart. The assault on the couple gradually faded from everyone else's memory. New crimes took away police resources, and the case went cold. Meanwhile, the public forgot about the incident and dismissed it as either random, where the attacker probably left town, or, if it was intentional, then it occurred for personal reasons, which were none of their business. The illusion of safety was shattered for Texarkana on the morning of Sunday, March 24th, when at about 9 a.m., a motorist driving from Highway 67 noticed a beat-up Oldsmobile that appeared abandoned on a nearby lover's lane. He decided to drive over to investigate it, as it appeared that someone inside was sleeping in a very unnatural position. As the concerned citizen approached the vehicle, he noticed blood dripping from under the door, and he drove away to the nearest payphone as fast as he could to call the sheriff. Inside the car were the bodies of Richard L. Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. Sheriff Presley was at the scene and immediately made the connection between this murder on a dirt road that served as a lover's lane at night and his previous case. The location and the targeting of the victims was the same. Plus, Richard Griffin's pants were pulled down to his ankles when he died. The killer's tactic seemed to be that he would disable the male by having him pull his pants down at gunpoint. Then, he would kill him first to eliminate him as a threat so he could take his time with the female. Despite the sheriff making a connection between the two attacks, the investigation of this crime scene was botched from the very beginning. It had rained between the murder and discovery, which potentially destroyed evidence outside of the car. But if some did survive, then what happened next is inexcusable by modern policing standards. News of a double murder spread across Texarkana, and crowds of curious people quickly appeared on the scene, which was not roped off. Footprints from the onlookers contaminated everything, and in one instance, the keys to the 1941 Oldsmobile were discovered dozens of feet away from the car, probably unintentionally kicked by a spectator and found by a child whose father promptly turned him over to the police. Richard Griffin's body was discovered in the front seat of the car. He died in a kneeling position with his pants down and the pockets turned inside out. Most likely he believed that he was being robbed and cooperated to survive. For that, he was rewarded with 2 bullets to the back of his head. Polly Ann Moore was found in the back seat of the car with 2 bullet wounds to the back of her head. Outside of the car was a blanket with blood on it. The police believed that she was killed outside of the car on the blanket and then dumped in the car by her murderer in an effort to conceal the crime for as long as possible. Sheriff Presley launched a local investigation to determine what the couple was doing in the hours leading up to their deaths. And he also contacted state law enforcement in Texas and Arkansas, his police counterparts in Texarkana on the Arkansas side, plus the Texas Rangers and the FBI. The Texas Rangers promised to dispatch someone to assist in the investigation. Meanwhile, the bodies of the couple were examined by a local doctor who determined that Polly Ann Moore did not appear to have been sexually assaulted. It was noted that she had on a sanitary pad, so it might have been possible that her period had prevented her killer from raping her. However, a complete pathologist's report was not performed. Polly Ann's body was quickly released to her family so that they could have a funeral and bury her. The 2 bullets that killed her were not removed from her skull. Bullet shells were found on the scene to have come from a .32 caliber weapon, so maybe the local police thought it was not necessary to put this young woman's body through any more trauma. Richard's car would only be removed in the afternoon, hours after it was discovered. It was towed and taken to the Texarkana Police Department on the Arkansas side, because they had better fingerprinting equipment. But during that process, many hands had touched the car in the effort to remove it, leading many to wonder what was the point, as it was now contaminated, and if the killer's prints were on there, then they had probably been wiped away. Richard Griffin's family arrived at the Texas Sides police station to claim his body at about the same time that Texas Ranger Jimmy Gear showed up to offer his assistance. Right away, he was appalled at the mistakes that the police made, and he refused to allow Griffin's body to be released until the bullets were removed from his head and collected as evidence. The bodies, bullet shells, and bullets would be the only usable clues from the crime scene. Ballistic tests confirmed that the weapon was a .32 caliber semi-automatic handgun that was most likely a Colt. The local investigation determined that the last time anyone, besides their killer, saw the couple alive was around 11 p.m. at a restaurant as they ate dinner. About 60 people were questioned about the murder, and about 100 dead ends were chased down. But in the end, the police were no closer to finding the killer than they were when they first found the bodies. The only difference now was that the Texas Rangers were involved, and the FBI was offering a supportive relationship with assistance in processing forensic evidence. And yet, as March turned into April, there were no new viable leads, and the contaminated evidence told them nothing. But now, armed with better resources, along with the benefit of learning from their past mistakes, the police would unfortunately get another chance to find this mysterious killer when he struck again on Palm Sunday of that year, leaving 2 more people dead. The Phantom Killer did not yet receive his name in the aftermath of the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. That happened after the discovery of 2 new victims on Sunday, April 14th, 1946. And the sad story of the events leading up to this double homicide began the day before. Paul Martin was a teenager in high school from Texarkana, but his family moved to another town for business reasons. However, Paul would often make visits to his original hometown and stay with friends. So on Sunday, April 13th, he borrowed the family car and made the drive. His mother, Inez, was nervous for him to be going on this trip, but not because there was a double murder 3 weeks before. Instead, she was worried about her teenage son driving by himself on a 100-mile trip during an era when traffic-related fatalities were greater than they are today. But to her relief, he called her when he arrived to tell her that he got there okay. It seemed like he had a specific purpose to his weekend visit, and that was to connect with Betty Jo Booker. Paul and Betty Jo were originally from the Arkansas side of Texarkana, where they were classmates before they both moved. Betty relocated to the Texas side after her widowed mother remarried. Paul made a lot of effort to find Betty and get her on a group date to a midnight showing at the local Paramount Theater. There was a lot of missed phone messages and a few missed encounters, but the two did communicate, and they arranged for Paul to pick her up after her band's performance at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall in town. The jazz band, the Rhythmeraires, were playing a show. They were a group of teenage musicians led by local 16-year-old Jerry Atkins. Betty was part of the group as a saxophone player. The town had a large population of young veterans who just returned from World War II, and the performance was a success for everyone except Paul. The show went on to 1:30 in the morning, so he missed his opportunity to take Betty to the movies. But he remained there until the end. It was about 2 in the morning when Betty was finished with the gig. The two of them stepped into his car and drove away. Some of their friends were having a slumber party, and there was an invitation for Paul and Betty to join them. But before she could do anything, she needed to return home and drop off her saxophone. It was an expensive instrument, and when she was not using it, she needed to keep it safe. Every time when she had a gig, that was her ritual: return the instrument before going out with friends. But this time, she didn't do that. Early that Sunday morning, a Texarkana resident recalled hearing gunshots from the direction of Spring Lake Park at around 5:30. This man was more annoyed than alarmed, as he figured that some inconsiderate person was doing target practice at this hour. About half an hour later, around 6 a.m., another person saw an older car drive away from the park, but it was too far and too dark to make out any details or the license plate. Then at about 6:30 a.m., a motorist discovered the body of Paul Martin laying on the side of North Park Road across the street from a fence. He promptly alerted the police, and they sprang into action with Sheriff Presley in the lead. The area was roped off, and Paul's abandoned car was found about a mile away from his body. Paul had been shot 4 times. It appeared that he was first shot at the fence, was wounded, and then stumbled across the road, where his killer shot him 2 more times to end his young life. At about the same time that Paul Martin was discovered, Betty Jo Booker's parents realized that she never returned home the night before, and started calling her friends to see where she could be. When they learned that she was last seen with Paul Martin, and that Paul Martin had been found dead, they assumed the worst and alerted the police. A detailed search of the park was performed, and at 11:30, Betty Jo Booker's body was found near a group of trees. She had been shot in the chest and face by her killer as he looked at her. The FBI arrived and took charge of collecting forensic evidence at the scene. The car was thoroughly dusted for fingerprints. Plasters of possible tire tracks belonging to the murderer were made, and other footprints were noted and mapped. As they combed through the park, Sheriff Presley found an address book that belonged to Paul. He noted where it was and collected it as evidence, while keeping it to himself, knowing that this detail not becoming public knowledge could crack the case. At the same time, every item in Paul's car was meticulously cataloged, and one object was determined to have possibly belonged to their murderer: a black piece of hat cord with elastic in the center. If they could figure out what brand hat this came from, then they could maybe track where it was sold and possibly narrow down the geography of where the murderer had purchased it. It was a long shot, but any chance to find the killer needed to be pursued. Pathology reports were performed on both teens. Booker was found to have traces of semen on her body. It appeared that the motivation of these killings was sexual and sadistic in nature. The only other possible lead to go on here was that Betty Jo Booker's saxophone was missing, so if the police could find that, then it could lead them to the killer. The saxophone had a serial number, and pawn shops across all 4 states were alerted to look out for it. The second double murder of 2 teens from well-respected families alerted the public that a serial killer was on the loose. Shock from the first murders devolved into panic. Guns and ammunition rapidly sold out from every store, along with locks for home doors and windows. Overnight, the town transformed into a state of paranoia where everyone locked their doors. This was unheard of just weeks before. In the 1940s, home alarm systems did not exist, so most people improvised by rigging their own using pots and pans with strings. It was now that the Texarkana Gazette gave the serial killer his nickname of the Phantom, due to his ability to ambush his victims and take them by surprise, while afterwards disappearing without a trace. No one realized at the time that this name, which was created on the fly, would still stick decades later. Curfews were put in place to keep as few people as possible on the streets at night. The police set up decoy cars on Lover Lane roads outside of town with the hopes of baiting the killer. They soon ran into the problem that teenagers were also setting up their own decoy systems with the goal of finding vigilante justice. This frustrated law enforcement and it forced Texas Ranger Captain Manuel T. Gazolas, who was becoming the de facto spokesman for the case, to warn people from doing that, as this would be a great way to get yourself killed. Possible suspects were listed and their fingerprints were sent to the FBI to cross-check against the latest crime scene, but every name came back negative. And just like the other cases, the old frustrations returned. No one saw anything and no one heard anything. But with police patrols out at all the lovers' lanes, pressure was kept to keep this murderer from acting out on his urges again. But without any potential victims on the street, the murderer was now finding himself in a position where if he wanted to kill again, then he would need to go to someone's home to do it. And this would take the boiling public panic up to a completely new level. In the days that followed the double murder of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, the ballistic tests from the FBI came back, confirming that the bullets were fired from the same gun that killed Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. Investigators were working under the assumption that the two murders were the work of the same killer, and now they had the physical proof to link them. Panic was sweeping over the twin cities of Texarkana. Everyone covered their windows at night while keeping a firearm within arm's reach. When husbands were out of town for business, wives took their children to stay at the Grim Hotel for safety. Meanwhile, anyone out after dark ran the risk of being shot by their jumpy neighbor who was afraid that the Phantom was coming after them. If the Phantom's preferred method of finding a victim was to stalk unsuspecting couples on lovers' lanes, then he was out of luck. The only people out after dark on these roads were undercover cops hoping to catch him. In order to kill again, he was going to need to change his strategy. But these new circumstances might have also been welcomed by the mystery killer. In the decades since his killing spree, psychologists who study serial killers have learned that for some, there is a narcissistic pleasure in eluding the police and thinking that they are smarter than the detectives hunting them. Many will change their killing routines in order to throw off their investigators, in the hope that they might not be able to connect the crimes because they are so different. On Friday night, March 3rd, the killer struck again. Virgil Stark was a 37-year-old farmer with a home-based welding shop who lived outside of Texarkana in Miller County on the Arkansas side. His wife, Katie, was 36 years old, and they had known each other since childhood. The Starks did not have any children, but their house was different than the others in the area because it had electricity, and even more rare was that it had a telephone. The telephone number was registered to Virgil's welding business. At about 9 p.m., Virgil sat down to relax after a long, hard week with his newspaper and radio in his living room. He sat in his favorite chair, took an electric heater, and put it on his lower back for pain relief, while Katie was in the bedroom in her nightgown, getting ready to go to sleep. The windows were all closed, but unlike Virgil's other neighbors, the shade in his living room was left up. Either he forgot to pull it down, or he didn't fear the Phantom, as he thought that the short distance from Texarkana was on his side. Katie heard a noise outside near the welding shop and called out to her husband. Before he could respond, she was startled by two loud popping sounds coming from the living room. She rushed in to see what happened and found Virgil dead in the chair. Knowing that he was shot in the head and knowing that the Phantom was on the loose, she ran to the kitchen phone and was shot twice in the face as she tried to call for help. Miraculously, it was not fatal, but she could not see as her eyes were being blinded by her blood. She heard someone trying to enter through the back door, and she crawled to the front door, where she ran away to her neighbor's house. Law enforcement from Miller County and Arkansas State Police were on the scene, and they were shortly joined by the FBI and Texas Rangers. When they first arrived, the living room was smoky because the electric heater was still plugged in. Once that was taken care of, they took in the crime scene. After shooting Virgil and Katie, the killer broke in through the kitchen door and walked through the house before leaving through the front. A footprint from the killer's shoe was found in the kitchen, providing a vital clue to investigators. And there was a unique-looking flashlight found outside that they believed belonged to the murderer. Bloodhounds were deployed, and they followed the murderer's trail for about 200 yards before it went cold at the highway near a set of tire tracks. Forensic investigators took casts of the tracks. There was debate back then, which still goes on today, about whether the Starks were the victims of the Phantom Killer or someone else. For one, a completely different gun was used. Virgil Starks was killed with .22 caliber bullets that investigators believed was fired from a semi-automatic rifle. The Starks, while not old, were in their later 30s, while the other victims were in their teens and 20s. They were targeted in their home, and Katie Stark was not sexually assaulted. Some people suspect that Virgil Stark was deliberately murdered by someone who had a grudge against him that figured they could get away with murder because it would be blamed on the Phantom. Investigators explored this theory and couldn't find anyone who had something against a man that would drive them to murder. Likewise, if this was a murder with a personal motive where the killer was angry at Virgil Stark, then he probably would not have stopped shooting him after 2 shots. And all of the other victims of the Phantom were killed with 2 bullets, with the exception of Paul Martin, who was shot 4 times. It appeared that the killer may have been familiar with the Starks, but what drew him to their house that night was seeing Virgil in the window with his back to it. The Phantom snuck up to the house and shot him through the glass. When Katie Stark entered the room, the Phantom did not shoot her right away. Only when he saw her run to the phone did he attempt to kill her before she could call the police. This suggests that he did not know they had a phone, or else he would have cut the line before making his attack. The flashlight that was dropped outside of the window was another sign that he was in a panic, and it was also a possible connection to the first attack, where the Phantom's only living victims were blinded with a bright flashlight. When he broke into the home through the kitchen and saw that Katie Stark had escaped, he got the hell out of there as fast as he could and either forgot the flashlight or couldn't remember where he dropped it. The flashlight and its batteries were dusted for fingerprints, but none were found. The .22 caliber new murder weapon can also be explained as the killer switching his gun, because there were police roadblocks everywhere, on the lookout for men with .32 caliber pistols. Most investigators believed that this crime was connected to the previous ones, while some had doubts at the time. Today, the general consensus is that this was the work of the Phantom. Katie Stark miraculously made it to the hospital and survived her wounds while being placed in critical care. She would physically heal, while psychologically she will always be scarred. The murder of Virgil Stark, as he sat in his home, only increased the public paranoia. A pattern was now established where these murders were happening every 3 weeks. As the days went on, the public dreaded the arrival of May 24th. The Texarkana Gazette published an interview with Jeanne Larey, where she detailed her experience on the night she was attacked. This forced Sheriff Presley to admit publicly that their attack was related to the murders, and the idea that a lunatic wearing a mask was doing this just made people more horrified. It was a real-life slasher movie before that film genre even existed. As Memorial Day came, law enforcement was dealing with a heavily armed, anxious and paranoid public, very few clues, and no witnesses. When Katie Stark recovered, she admitted that she never saw the shooter. As the town braced for the next attack, law enforcement was working against the clock to bring this maniac to justice. But would they catch the right guy? The Phantom's murder pattern showed a 3-week cooling period, which meant that the next killing would most likely occur around the 24th of May. But unfortunately, the police were still no closer to catching him. The 3 surviving witnesses could not tell them any identifying information about the killer. The tire tracks from the crime scenes were identified as being from the brand Allstate and were sold at every Sears store across the country, which meant that they couldn't be narrowed down any further. The hat cord found in Paul Martin's car was taken by the FBI to various clothing manufacturers and suppliers in New York City, and it was determined to be too generic to narrow down. The only useful information was that it was a few years old because of the elastic material, and it most likely belonged to a black or gray hat. This became a dead end. Betty Jo Booker's saxophone was still missing, and they put alerts for it in pawn shops across the 4 states, but so far there were no tips coming in. Officers were working on the case in 24-hour shifts. A $10,000 reward, worth over $160,000 today, was offered, and Sheriff Presley begged the public to send them any tips about anyone who was unaccounted for at the time of the murders. The tips flooded in, and each one fizzled out when the police checked it out. The footprint from the Stark house was examined, and it was determined that the shoes were either incredibly beat up and worn down, or they were altered so that a shoe print could not be identified. In other words, they couldn't tell what brand it was. There was also speculation among some working on the case that the footprint in the Stark house was caused by a careless police officer and not the killer himself, as the crime scene was flooded with lawmen walking everywhere. Arkansas State Police Detective Max Tackett was one of the first lawmen to arrive on the scene, and he felt a tinge of guilt about the crime. That night, he and his partner were rushing back to their headquarters to hand in an expense report before a deadline that was approaching by the minute. If they arrived late, then they were not going to be reimbursed for things that they paid for out of their own pockets. Tackett was very diligent about creating roadblocks and checking every suspicious car for the Phantom. And as they drove that night, he spotted an old car parked on a dirt road that was popular with bootleggers. He wanted to check it out, but if he did, then he was going to be late. He planned to go back and take a look after he handed in his reports. But he was too late, and to make matters worse, the trail that the bloodhounds were following went cold where the car was parked. It was gone, and all that remained was a pile of cigarette butts, during a time when no one had even heard about DNA, let alone knew how to test for it. As May entered June, another murder did not occur. Tackett was diverted into taking on new casework, and a lot of that involved stolen cars. As he looked through his new assignments, he discovered a pattern that coincided with the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. Every time there was a new killing, a stolen car would be abandoned and a new one would be taken. This was not much to go by, but it did add another layer to this investigation if these crimes turned out to be related. Some crimes are solved by a stroke of luck, if we use the definition that luck occurs when preparation meets opportunity. In late June, Tackett was assigned a new case by his supervisor. An angry farmer was upset because his tenant did not pay his rent and had disappeared. Tackett went out to meet with the farmer and learned that this deadbeat drove a 1941 Plymouth which the farmer had written down the license plate of. When Tackett ran it, it came back as stolen. Tackett was also given the name of the missing man, Youell Lee Swinney. Swinney had come from a broken home where his parents divorced when he was 9 years old. His brothers and sisters would go on to become respectable, hard-working, law-abiding citizens, while Youell turned out to be the black sheep of the family and was in trouble with the law ever since he was 12 years old. He missed serving in World War II because he was in prison and was released in December of 1945. He had a long record, which included car theft, and an interview with a young relative provided a tip that he had a preferred parking lot in Texarkana that he liked to use. The police began to frequently check this lot for the stolen Plymouth, and on June 28th, it was found there unoccupied. An officer watched the car, and when a young woman opened it, she was arrested for possession of stolen property. She identified herself as Peggy Lois Swinney, and earlier that day, she married Youell to become his wife. She claimed that Youell was out of town, and that she didn't know where he went or when he was coming back. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Texas, a town that was 23 miles away from Texarkana, a well-dressed tall man in a suit pulled into Ed Hammock's used car lot with a Plymouth that was in pristine condition. This man tried to explain to Hammock that he had just lost his job and needed to sell the car urgently. Hammock was immediately suspicious, as many people have tried to sell stolen cars in the past, and when they are recovered, it's the dealer who is always at a loss. He asked the man if he had the title. The man said he forgot it, but he offered to mail it if Hammock wanted to buy the car right now. Hammock declined, and the man drove away towards Texarkana. He immediately reported the man to his local sheriff, who then radioed it to Texarkana so that they could stop him as he entered the town because the car was definitely looking like it was stolen. The license plate was checked, and it turned out that they were right. This car was taken from a town on the other side of the state. The police in Texarkana found the car and tracked the suspect down. He tried to make a run, but the officers caught who they assumed was just a car thief. Then things began to change. They learned that the man they arrested was Youell Lee Swinney, and as the cuffs were being placed on him, he became distressed. He made a comment that they wanted him for more than stealing cars, and that he was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Officers were confused by these statements, which they initially racked up to an overly nervous criminal. But other incriminating words continued to flow from him, like will he get the electric chair for this, and would he be out in 25 years? But as Swinney got to the police station and was booked, he realized that he was arrested purely for just the car theft. The cops put together his statements with the unsolved phantom crimes and car thefts on the night of the murders, which caused them to realize this skinny man they picked up could very well be the notorious serial killer they were looking for. But when they tried to question Swinney, his panic was over. He clammed up and refused to tell the detectives anything. As word spread among investigators that a suspect in the phantom murders was in custody, no one had any desire to let him go. They held him on the car charges, while they worked on the possibility of proving that he was behind the murders as well. His home was searched, and a shirt with the name Stark written on the tag was found. FBI tests found metal fragments inside the pockets that were matched with other fragments found inside Virgil Stark's welding shop. When Katie Stark was asked to identify if this was her husband's shirt, she at first thought it was, but on second thought, she could not definitely say so. She did not want her word being the thing that could possibly send an innocent man to the electric chair. At this moment, she displayed far more kindness than the man who shot her and her husband had demonstrated towards them. Meanwhile, Peggy was still in custody at Miller County Jail, and she was talking to investigators. She and Youell had met in January when she was arrested for drunken disorder, and he was at the same jail bailing out a different woman. After that, something clicked between the pair, and she started to follow him like a loyal sidekick as they wandered through Texas, stealing cars and clothing. This habit Youell had for stealing clothes was one more piece of circumstantial evidence against him in regards to the shirt that said Stark. Finally, after days of questioning, Peggy agreed to turn on her husband and tell them what she knew about Youell on the night of the attacks. And what she would say would match some of the information that was withheld from the public, while also creating more questions about the murders that would need to be answered should the police hope to get a conviction against the phantom killer. On the night that Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jeanne Larey were attacked, Youell Swinney and his girlfriend Peggy were out drinking with one of Youell's friends. Youell and Peggy got into a fight, and he hit her in front of this friend. The friend stepped between them and took Peggy away to her parents' house, while Youell was left by himself to cool down. Investigators now believe that the opposite happened. He was angry that his friend took his girl away from him, and he might not have been able to physically hurt this person in a fair fight. So he might have gotten a mask, flashlight, and a gun, so he could overpower this other man without being recognized. The Richmond Road site of the first attack was near Peggy's parents' house, and it's possible he might have thought that she was in the car, which only made him angrier. When it turned out not to be his friend and Peggy, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jeanne Larey became substitutes for his rage and barely survived. On the night that Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were killed, Youell and Peggy were back in Texarkana. Peggy claimed that Youell left her alone in a motel for a while, but when her alibi was checked, the motel owner said that her and Youell came early in the morning instead of late at night. She denied having any knowledge of the first attack or the first double murder, but she claimed to have been with Youell when he murdered Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. That night the couple were out drinking in Texarkana, and when the bar closed at 1 a.m., they bought a few beers to drink on the road as they wandered around. A couple hours later, Youell said that he was in the mood to rob someone, so they drove to Spring Lake Park to find a victim. They discovered a parked car with two people inside who were talking. They walked out of their car and walked to Paul and Betty. Youell Swinney had a glove on one hand and his .32 caliber pistol in the other. They forced the teens out of their car and dragged them to theirs, where Peggy drove as Youell kept the gun on the teens. During her statement, she called Martin that little boy and Booker that little girl. Peggy gave the impression that what she witnessed seriously disturbed her. About a mile later, they saw a fence, and Swinney made Peggy pull over. He forced Martin out of the car and shot him twice. He patted Paul down, took out his wallet, stole the money inside, put it back, and found his address book. Swinney got back in the vehicle and made Peggy turn the car around. As they drove past the fence, they saw Paul trying to walk. Swinney got out of the car again and shot Paul in the head twice. As Paul was killed, Peggy claimed that she was trying to comfort Betty. They then drove to another spot, and Swinney got out of the car with Betty. He walked into the woods with her and returned about half an hour later, after Peggy thought she heard gunshots. He was covered in blood. They drove back to Paul's car, and Swinney took out the saxophone so he could pawn it. As they drove away, he changed his mind because he realized that the saxophone could be tied to the murders. So he threw it out the window. Before leaving the park, they stopped at another spot, and Swinney changed out of his bloody clothing. The place where Peggy said this happened coincided with the spot where Paul Martin's discarded address book was found, and that was not public knowledge. Only someone who was actually there would be able to tie this together. Following the double murder, she and Swinney went back to her parents' house for a couple days and then drove to Dallas. While driving there, they stopped to burn the bloody clothes on the side of the road. Peggy said she was not exactly sure of what Swinney did with the gun he used that night. Investigators believe that he either gave it away or sold it during his travels outside of the Texarkana area as he continued to steal cars. On the night of Virgil Stark's murder, the couple were staying with Peggy's sister in Arkansas, and her brother-in-law got into an argument with Swinney. Swinney stormed out of their house angry, but Peggy claimed to not know where he went. Investigator Max Tackett did not believe that part of the story. The cigarette butts at the place where the car was parked suggested two people were there, while only one set of tracks led to the Stark house across his newly planted field. He believed that Peggy sat in the car and waited as Swinney went off to commit murder. But regardless, Peggy's statement was enough to put away her husband for the rest of his life. She was witness to two murders that were definitely connected to two more. The Stark shirt could lead to another conviction there, and to top it all off, the stolen car they used that night had Allstate tires. The Phantom Killer appeared to be in custody. All the police needed to do now was tie up the loose ends with the details. But once that was set in motion, the entire case began to fall apart. In order to tie the entire statement of Peggy Lois Swinney together, the investigators needed just one concrete piece of physical evidence that would remove any reasonable doubt a jury might have. So they came up with a plan. Bring Peggy to Dallas so that she could identify the place where Youell burnt the bloody clothes that he was wearing when he murdered Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. They were hoping that they might get lucky and find some evidence that survived the flames. On July 28th, they took her on a road trip, and during that drive, she made another confession. She said that she made her entire statement up. The police were dumbfounded. They tried to reason with her, but she refused to say anything else. If she was anyone else, they could have forced her to testify about what she said against Youell with threats like perjury and contempt of court. But for her they couldn't, because you can't force spouses to testify against each other. Now there were definitely parts of her statement that only a person could know if they were present at Spring Lake Park as Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker were murdered. Another direct link between her story and the truth emerged in the autumn of 1946, when Betty Jo Booker's rusted saxophone was discovered in the area she said Youell dumped it in. During the original search, it was obscured by spring foliage, but once the leaves fell, it became visible. But other things she said seemed dubious, like she was trying to downplay her roles in these crimes, to present herself as an observer and not a participant. Regardless of her retractions, she made the statements, and should she one day get divorced from Youell, they could then force her to testify against him. For now, everything they had against him was circumstantial, and all it took was one juror to have doubts, if they took the case to trial as it was. If he was found not guilty, then they wouldn't be able to try him again. But that did not mean that they were just going to let him go free and release him back onto the streets either. They had him for stealing multiple cars, and because he had been convicted multiple times before for other crimes, they tried him as a habitual offender, which under Texas law meant life in prison. On February 12, 1947, Youell Lee Swinney received his life sentence in a Boston, Texas court. 1 week later, Peggy Lois Swinney approached investigators again, this time with her parents, and told them that her original confession was true. Officials then questioned Youell in prison, and he said that his wife was a complete moron, and this was a complete lie. Shortly after, she retracted her statement again. A couple years later, after investigators lost touch with her, she divorced Youell. FBI agents Horace Halliot and Dale Simpson believed that the details in Peggy's statements could only come from someone who was at the crime when it happened. Now, she was interviewed multiple times by numerous law enforcement agents before giving the statement, so it's possible she pieced the details together, but it's very unlikely, and they think that she was telling the truth. Peggy, for her part, claims that she only made the statement because she was under duress, which does not explain why she came forward with it again after Youell was locked up for life. In October of 1948, Texas prison officials contacted the FBI to tell them that 2 informants alerted them that Youell Lee Swinney said, "If that woman ever talks, they will surely stick me for them." That woman was a reference to his wife Peggy. There was other evidence, both for and against the theory that Youell Lee Swinney was the Phantom Killer. The shirt with the name Stark, that contained metal fragments which matched others from his welding shop, was the strongest piece of physical evidence they had. But the Plymouth Peggy claimed they used during the second double murder was recovered, and no blood was found in it. Also, Swinney's fingerprints were compared with the crime scenes, and he was not a match. But this could also be explained by him wearing gloves. Some investigators from this case firmly believed that Youell Lee Swinney was definitely the killer, but others were not fully convinced. Sheriff Bill Presley, the first lead investigator on the scene of the first attack, continued to investigate these crimes throughout his career, just in case they got the wrong guy. And he would be relentless in his search for the Phantom Killer of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders during his time as the sheriff of Bowie County. Although a suspect was in prison, no one was convicted of the murders or even brought to trial. The case was never closed because we cannot be completely certain if Youell Lee Swinney was the Phantom Killer or if the real murderer got away with it. Max Tackett and Arkansas Miller County Deputy Tillman Johnson both believed until their deaths that Youell Lee Swinney was the Phantom Killer. One fact in their favor was that after Swinney was arrested and locked up, there were not any more murders. Texas's Bowie County Sheriff Bill Presley, the man who was investigating these crimes since the first attacks, was not fully convinced. Throughout the rest of the 1940s, he submitted tens of thousands of fingerprints to the FBI for them to check against the unidentified, latent prints found in Paul Martin's car. None of them came back as matches. Dr. Anthony LaPala, a psychologist at the medium security Federal Correction Prison located in Texarkana, was tapped to create a profile of the Phantom. He believed that the killer was in his mid-30s to 50s, and that sex and sadism were the motivations for these crimes. The killer was intelligent, clever, and shrewd. He was not afraid of police activity, but was aware of it enough to shift his crimes to evade apprehension. He most likely led a normal life, probably was not a veteran, and did not necessarily need to be a resident of Texarkana, despite his knowledge of it. The killer planned his crimes well, worked alone, and told no one about his activities. He could also shift his crimes to another community and start over. This profile also claimed that the killer was most likely a white man. Most importantly, they believed that he would go on killing until he is captured. Surviving victim Jimmy Hollis described the Phantom as, "I know he's crazy. The crazy things he said made me feel that his mind was warped." The Youell Lee Swinney was the real killer theory answers a lot of questions, but not all of them. And if Youell was not the real murderer, then who was? With the exception of the Stark murder, all of the other attacks happened in secluded locations, after the victims had spent a considerable amount of time in public places. Another coincidence between all of the women is that they were all white and they all had short brown hair. And while the murders in Texarkana stopped after Virgil Stark's death, there was always the possibility that the killer simply relocated somewhere else to continue his spree. Similar crimes of young couples in cars being murdered on lovers' lanes would go on for decades across the United States. By 1947, the mood in Texarkana began to lighten as the murders ceased, and Sheriff Presley abandoned the exclusive belief that the killer was a white man when he started to submit hundreds of fingerprints of known African American criminals to the FBI to be checked. All of the results came back negative. In 1949, investigators thought they caught a break when a bridge painter from the Missouri Pacific Railroad discovered a .32 caliber Colt pistol wrapped in cloth and stashed in a crevice. The gun was rusted, but it was cleaned up and sent to the FBI for a ballistics analysis. When the results came back, it was determined not to be the same gun used in the 1946 Phantom murders. After 1950, with no leads left to investigate, the case officially went cold. In 1960, the FBI re-examined their files to see if anything was missed or if advances in technology could help solve the case, but they came up with nothing. And from this point, the investigation of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders passed from law enforcement professionals to amateur sleuths. The cities of Texarkana have recovered from their summer of paranoia. 30 years after the serial killings, independent filmmaker Charles B. Pierce produced and released the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown in 1976. It was loosely based off the real-life murders. Since 2003, the film is shown around every Halloween as part of Spring Lake Park's Movies in the Park annual series. This is the same place where Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker were murdered. The film was given a remake that morphed into a sequel in 2014. Youell Lee Swinney appealed his life sentence on the grounds that he was not offered a court-appointed lawyer for his 1941 conviction. Numerous witnesses to the trial claimed that was not true, but the appeals court sided with the career criminal, and he was released in 1973. Part of the reason of how Swinney was able to overturn his conviction was that a lot of the people involved in his original trial were dead and could not refute his claims. 1973 was 27 years after the Phantom's murder spree. Furthermore, Peggy Lois Swinney divorced her husband after he was put in prison for life, and she remarried. Murder does not have a statute of limitations, so why didn't anyone who knew that he was suspected to be the Phantom try to pursue a conviction now that the original roadblock of a wife testifying against her husband was gone? Either way, Youell Lee Swinney did not live happily ever after. He would be back in prison 2 years later for counterfeiting. Just after his release, he was put away again for larceny in 1981. By the 1990s, he was released after suffering from a stroke and placed in a nursing home. Phantom killer researcher Mark Bledsoe believed that Swinney was the real murderer. Before Swinney's arrest, he had been accused of sexual perversion, and interviews with his former cellmates revealed that Swinney disclosed details about the crimes that were not in the newspapers. Bledsoe interviewed Swinney in 1992 when the former car thief was an elderly man with difficulty walking and speaking. When Bledsoe brought up the murders, Swinney became angry and said, "I got off on that and I was cleared." He died on September 15th, 1994. None of Swinney's relatives claimed his body, and it was donated to the University of Texas Health Science Center in Dallas for the purpose of being dissected by aspiring doctors. There was speculation of May of 1946 about an eighth victim when the body of Earl McSpadden was discovered on the railroad tracks 16 miles north of Texarkana. A train had ran over him before his corpse was discovered, severing his left arm and leg. But a coroner's report stated that he died at the hands of a person unknown before the train accident. Law enforcement did not link this death to the case, but some people at the time suspected that McSpadden was either killed by the Phantom or he may have been the real Phantom himself and committed suicide out of guilt. There have been multiple confessions to the murders, which investigators determined to be false. In 1948, Duty Tennyson, a former classmate of Betty Jo Booker, committed suicide and left a note saying that he was the real Phantom Killer. A large number of people support this theory. He worked at the movie theater in town as an usher, which put him in contact with all of the Phantom's victims. But a follow-up investigation proved that multiple alibis placed him away from the scene of the Booker-Martin double murder on April 14th, 1946. Ralph B. Bauman, a 21-year-old Navy pilot, turned himself in to Los Angeles police, saying that he blacked out over a period of days and believed himself to be the Phantom Killer preying on Texarkana. His claims were taken seriously and then dismissed after being investigated. Mary Jeanne Larey moved to Oklahoma to live with relatives and spent the rest of her life psychologically damaged by the attack she suffered and the murders that followed. She remarried and moved to Montana, where her life was cut short by cancer in 1965 when she was just 38 years old. Jimmy Hollis remarried 2 more times and had 4 children. He died in 1975 while attending his own brother's funeral at the age of 54. Katie Stark was still alive and living near Texarkana in the 1970s. When The Town That Dreaded Sunset was being produced, the filmmakers tried to interview her for a consultation. She denied them a meeting. She recovered from her injuries and remarried in 1955. On July 3, 1994, she passed away at the age of 84. Peggy Lois Swinney remarried to a man named Buster Reimer in the late 1940s. She died in 1998 while living in Texas. Sheriff Bill Presley passed away in the late 1970s. Max Tackett became police chief of Texarkana and died in 1972. His death before Swinney's 1973 release might be the reason why Swinney was never pursued for the deaths of 5 people as soon as he stepped out of prison. The physical evidence from the murders has either become lost or destroyed, so there's no way we can re-examine the evidence and search for DNA. Therefore, the identity of who the Phantom Killer was comes down to either believing it was Youell Lee Swinney or that the real killer got away and will never be known. But one thing we do know now is that in October of 1946, at Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Elaine Elridge and her boyfriend Lawrence Hogan were both shot to death in their parked car in a secluded spot overlooking the ocean. Ballistic reports state that the gun used was a .32 caliber pistol. There were no fingerprints or witnesses, and the case remains unsolved, with the murderer disappearing like a phantom.